Welcome in everybody to another edition of my roster review series with a look into the 2022 BC Lions. As I'm recording this, we just got word that the CFL CBA has finally been ratified. Thank goodness, as I said on Twitter. So I'm really excited to get going with this video, knowing that we actually have a season to look forward to. And with that said, let's get started talking about today's agenda, which we're going to start off by talking about this team in 2021, the results, and what we could take away from their season last year. Then we're going to go into their 2022 coaching staff, what coaches they're going to be bringing into this season. And then we're going to go into their 2022 positional rankings, where this team at every position stacks up relative to the rest of the CFL. And then we're going to go into their projected starting lineups, just kind of a mock lineup that I put together for each team, and potentially where they would slot in terms of their ratio and starters. And then finally, we're going to go into the team award predictions and a key storyline to watch out for the BC Lions. And with that said, let's get on to the 2021 recap. And it was really a tale of two seasons for the BC Lions last year. It looked really good at the start of the season. Some of that was masked by a really easy schedule to begin the season. I think they played Ottawa twice in the first 6 weeks. So they got off to a 4-2 start, and everybody was very optimistic that this team had turned a corner from what they were in 2019. But unfortunately, they just completely cratered out, losing 7 consecutive games, and up until the last game of the season where they finally broke that losing streak. Unfortunately, by then it was already too late. They were already out of playoff contention, and this team, as generally speaking, the last several years has not been too successful in terms of making playoff appearances and actually winning playoff games. So they're going to be looking to correct that going into this season. Now the guys that are going to be leading them into this attempted comeback with the coaching staff, and we're going to start with head coach Rick Campbell, very experienced veteran head coach in the CFL, but I think it's debatable how good of a head coach he really has been at the CFL level. The 49-71-2 career record just doesn't, look too pretty on paper, but you got to remember he was in the East with Ottawa a lot of those times, and he's coming off his first season here in BC in 2021. And the pressure is going to be on him. He has decided to go into this season with a Canadian at quarterback. This whole team is just very interesting to look at in paper, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. But Rick Campbell is going to be one of the favorites to get fired, I think, because of just the general expectations of this team and the fact that, he has had some struggles in terms of his overall record in the regular season as a CFL coach, and especially in a tougher Western division, there's going to be a lot of expectations for Rick Campbell going into this season. And then he's joined by offensive coordinator Jordan McKismick. I thought he did an okay job last year. I think a lot of his restraints were really in terms of his personnel that he was able to put out there, because I just think this team on the offensive line and everything like that just wasn't that talented last year. So I think McKismick did a pretty good job. And then defensive coordinator Ryan Phillips, very young coordinator here. He's actually one of the greatest players in the history of the BC Lions, one of the all-time leaders in interceptions. So exciting to have him here. And then finally, special teams coordinator Don Janowski. I don't know too much about the special teams coordinators across the league, if I'm being honest. I probably should know more, but just an interesting staff for the BC Lions going into this year. And like I said, I think there's a lot of pressure on this group to get it done. Now, with that in mind, let's get on to our positional rankings, starting with the quarterbacks. And they're going to come in at 8th in the CFL, and this really shouldn't surprise too many people, given the fact that there's just nothing that's proven here in terms of experience at the CFL level. And BC's going into the season with a Canadian quarterback duo, and it's going to be very exciting for a lot of fans of the CFL that have been waiting for this for a long time to actually go into a season with a for sure Canadian starting quarterback. But at the same time, you just wonder if he has the surrounding pieces to succeed. But in terms of actual questions about Nathan Rourke's talents, I don't have many. So he's a second-year passer who showcased potential as a true rookie in 2021, actually saw legitimate playing time, started the season opener surprisingly after an injury to Mike Riley. So I thought it was incredibly impressive that Rourke was able to actually make an impact in year one. He has really good arm strength and mobility tools that will help him in his first season as a starter. Obviously, there are concerns about inexperience, and there will likely be growing pains, but I do think with enough playing time, he can be a starting caliber quarterback in the CFL. And then Michael O'Connor, another Canadian quarterback here, who's inexperienced but has a big arm and has been in the CFL the last couple of seasons with Calgary and Toronto. He's only really gotten one extended look in terms of actually playing in a CFL game. That was back in 2019, I believe, in the season finale for Toronto versus Hamilton. So not too much of a meaningful game that he got a chance to play in there. So very inexperienced in terms of the top two guys there. And then finally, adding to this inexperienced quarterback room, you have Kevin Thompson, who dressed as a backup for the final two games last season and played college football at Sacramento State. We'll see if he ultimately sees any action or if he's anything notable here. So overall, the main reason why I just can't have this quarterback group any higher is just the lack of experience. I think they've thrown combined less than 100 passes between all of these three guys at the CFL level. So there's a lot of concern about that going into this season. Now flipping over to running back, which is also going to come in at 8th in the CFL, and it's a pretty inexperienced group as well, but you do have James Butler, who's a pro football veteran who's coming off a solid first season in the CFL in 2021. He has experience in the XFL. He played, I believe, with the Houston Roughnecks and was actually very productive down there in the short time that XFL second edition lasted. But he looked pretty good last year in terms of being this team's best running back by season's end. And I don't think he's the flashiest runner in the world, but he brings a good mix of elusiveness and toughness in his rushing style. He also proved himself to be a reliable check-down option in the passing game, which is always good to see from a running back at the CFL level. Passing league, again, you got to be able to impact the game in terms of your pass blocking and pass catching if you want to succeed as a running back in this league. But behind him, you don't got any experience in this running back room in terms of guys that actually carry the ball. These last two guys, Mario Villazamar, who is a core special teamer who has played in 23 games for the Lions, but hasn't really carried the ball. He's more of that fullback type. And then David Mackey, who's a longtime veteran in the CFL and has been a career fullback and special teams piece, can occasionally catch a pass here or there, but not somebody that you're going to hand the ball off to on a regular basis. So overall, I actually do like James Butler, but there's just really not a whole lot here to judge this running back room off here, and that's why it's going to rank at number 8. Now, this is a spot that you could see rookies play a big role, and you only have 2 right now in training camp, so it gives you kind of a good idea that these 2 guys may actually see a lot of action this year. So we'll start with Bruce Anderson, who is a former standout at North Dakota State for the Bisons, a very successful FCS school. And then Darius Clark, who comes out of little-known Newberry College. So we'll see if these 2 guys, not traditional Division I A level guys, can make an impact this year. Now brightening the mood with the wide receivers, which are going to come in at 3rd in the CFL, and you have a couple of really big superstars in this unit, and you have a couple of interesting body types in terms of the supporting receivers as well. So we'll start with Brian Burnham, one of the league's most crafty route runners who also possesses top-tier hands. Burnham has been a standard of consistency and had another productive season in 2021. He's the type of receiver that can hurt you in all areas of the field, capable of catching a hitch and turning it into a first down, while also being able to get vertical down the field. So, in my opinion, he's probably the most well-rounded receiver in the entire CFL. I wouldn't say he's as explosive as a guy like Reggie Bagleton at this point, or even the guy we're about to talk about in a second, but ultimately I think Burnham's just such a reliable piece for this team and one of the best receivers in the league still. And then Lucky Whitehead, who's perhaps the league's fastest player. He was one of 2021's biggest breakout stars. One thing you know with Whitehead is that he can take any play to the house for a touchdown given his explosiveness. He doesn't run the most complex route tree, but ultimately he doesn't need to given his elite physical gifts. In addition, he can also still pinch hit at returner when the Lions are in need of a spark, so that's incredibly valuable. And simply said, I think Whitehead is an elite playmaker in his prime in the league, and he's only going to get better these next couple years because I think he's just still learning how to play the nuances of the receiver position and use the waggle and stuff like that to his advantage. And then I also really like Dominique Rhymes here, who's a bigger veteran receiver who missed a lot of time due to injury last season. He's capable of winning in contested catch situations, but also has some explosiveness to his game as well. In my opinion, he gives this unit a bit of something different than what you get with Whitehead and Burnham, because he's more of that bigger receiver that will win contested catch for you. Having that diversity of skill sets always matters in a CFL receiving core. And then Canadian Javon Catoy, another big body target. He has showcased plenty of potential the past few seasons, emerging as this team's top Canadian receiver. Catoy almost has a tight end type body, which he has gotten better at using to box out defenders over the middle of the field the last couple of seasons. Catoy also brings some yards after the catch potential if he can catch passes while in stride. And then after those guys, there's some questions about the depth of this unit, but I think there's some interesting names here, starting with Keon Hatcher, a second-year player who broke into the lineup in the back half of last season. It was a small sample size, but he flashed an ability to win in the red zone with a couple of touchdowns last year. He's a candidate to be a day one starter this year, in my opinion. We'll talk about him a little bit later on, but I do think he's going to be slotted into that starting lineup. And then Daniel Peterman, a possession receiver with good route running ability, but hasn't really displayed much upside, not too much vertical speed, but will be able to win in the short and intermediate game. He's a Canadian guy that could potentially be a player that you can use in your ratio. And then Jacob Scarfone, primarily a special teamer who got an opportunity to produce on offense in the season finale last year versus Edmonton. Let's see how he fits in amongst these Canadians in this receiver group. And then Cordell Hastings, who appeared in 7 games during his rookie season, but has yet to record a CFL catch. He played in U Sports for the Acadia Axemen. And then finally, Zach Parker, who I just realized is not on the screen right now. He played in 2 games for Montreal in 2019, but didn't record a catch. So overall, I think this team at the wide receiver position has so much high upside, especially with Whitehead and Burnham there, that they deserve this 3rd ranking in the CFL. Now, they also bring quite a few wide receivers to camp as rookies here, and we're going to skip over Zach Parker, who I just talked about, and talk about Jamarius Way, who's a bigger receiver at 6'4", who the Lions actually signed back in 2020, but he didn't attend training camp in 2021. And then Monte Crockett, a speedster who has been under contract for a few CFL teams, but hasn't played a game yet. I believe he was in training camp last year with the Blue Bombers. Jazz Ferguson, another player who was signed by the Lions in 2020, but didn't play for the team last year. Alexander Hollins, a 6 foot, 175-pound receiver out of Eastern Illinois. Sean Modster, a former Boise State standout. Josh Pearson, a bigger target at 6'4", 205 pounds. Dallas Dixon, a Canadian receiver from Simon Fraser, who comes to the Lions as an undrafted free agent. Micah Simon, who played his college football at BYU. And finally, the most interesting guy of this group, Ardarius Stewart, a former 3rd-round pick in the NFL out of Alabama by the New York Jets. He was in training camp last year with Winnipeg but didn't make the team and hasn't appeared in a CFL game yet. So ultimately, we'll see if any of these guys make a difference in their rookie seasons. Now moving on to the offensive line, and where do I start with this group? I just think there's still a lot of holes in terms of this unit, and maybe some of this stuff may be solved, and we'll talk a little bit about it later on, about the ratio situation. They may only start 2 Canadians up front on the offensive line, which allowed them to bring in some better American players potentially, but that's not always a strategy that's going to work. Ultimately, I just don't think there's just a lot of talent in terms of high-end upside in this unit, and we'll just start talking about them. So we'll start with Joel Figueroa, who I consider probably the best player of this unit. He's a solid veteran left tackle who has a solid floor, but doesn't possess the highest ceiling at this point in his career. He's been in the CFL since 2013 and has played in 90 career games. I think 2021 represented a little bit of a bounce back from Figueroa's 2019 performance, and I felt that he was this team's best run blocker, but overall, in terms of being the best guy of this unit, compared to other units in the league, that's just kind of disappointing. And then Suk Chung, who's a former All-Star at guard, he struggled the past 2 seasons after coming over to BC as a big-time free agent signing. One thing I think has been missing from his game the past few years is his physicality and push he provides in the run game. His pass blocking was also very inconsistent, and he took his fair share of penalties last year as well. That being said, I still think he's this unit's best Canadian for what it's worth, and I think there's still the potential that he could bounce back and get back to that elite level if he gets some better players around him. And then Peter Godber, who was honestly probably the league's worst starting center last year, looking outmatched physically resulting in being beaten badly in pass protection so many times. It was just too much to count, really. Godber is a former high draft pick of the team and has had multiple significant injuries, but a major improvement is needed for him to become an average CFL starter on the interior, in my opinion. I just think there's a long way to go with him in his development. He would be a really good backup for this team. I think he still possesses those physical tools, but I just think he just was not ready to be a full-time starter last year, and that really hurt the BC Lions up front. And then Kent Perkins, who actually earned the BC's nomination for Most Outstanding Offensive Lineman last year as a rookie. He anchored the team's right tackle position across 13 starts last season. He'll need to continue refining his pass protection technique, but there's talent there, and I think it was well deserved for him to win the team's Most Outstanding Offensive Lineman nomination last year. And then Philip Norman, an interesting player who's been around the organization since 2019 and has made 14 total starts, mostly as an interior lineman. However, out of those 14 total starts, only one of those games came last season. Still, I think he's a candidate to start at either guard or center if the Lions do go with those 3 American offensive linemen, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago. And then David Neville, a player with raw physical talent that the Lions have invested in the last few seasons. Ideally, I think Neville will play tackle in the CFL due to his size, as he stands at 6'8" with long arms. Unfortunately, when given opportunities, he just hasn't looked all too impressive to me, so we'll see if he can continue to grow as a player and potentially break into the starting lineup this season. And then Andrew Pearson, a veteran who dressed for all of last season as a backup. He has been with the Lions since 2018, so we'll see if there's any kind of breakout for him there. Jamar McGlosser, who saw a handful of starts last season with Ottawa but didn't really impress me. Jarrell Broxton, who started 1 game last season as a rookie but suffered a biceps injury that ended his season, unfortunately, so we'll see if he can bounce back after recovering from that injury. So ultimately, it's going to come in at last in the CFL, and I really hope I'm wrong about this unit, to be honest with you. I just, generally speaking, BC is my second favorite team in the CFL. I hope I'm wrong about this group, but I just think there's still too many holes, and they just didn't do enough to address this need this offseason. Now, maybe we'll see an offensive line rookie make an impact here, and we'll start with Noah Zaire, who is the team's second-round pick in the 2021 draft out of the University of Saskatchewan. Correct, that 22 CFL draft, this most recent CFL draft. He was seen as the most pro-ready lineman in this year's offensive line class, so we'll see if he can potentially figure in as a starter here as a rookie. Cole Levio, a native of American Samoa who played at Hawaii. Tyler Packer, a 6'6", 22-year-old out of the University of Calgary. Matt Gouvermont, who's a former 5th-round pick from 2020, who spent last year on the practice squad. He's a bit of an older rookie at 27 years old, so we'll keep an eye on him. And then finally, James Moore, a lineman from Central Washington. And so we'll see if any of these guys make an impact. I'm kind of surprised they don't have more rookie offensive linemen in camp this year, but again, we'll see if any of these guys actually break into the starting lineup this year. Now that we've covered the offense, let's flip over to the defense, and they're going to come in at 9th again here on the defensive line, and let's be honest, I just don't like this team in terms of their talent in the trenches, and there's potential for this team to be good in terms of their pass rush, I think, but I think they're giving up a lot in terms of their physicality up front. And let's just talk about these guys, starting with Abum Gwacham, who's a second-year CFLer with plenty of pro experience elsewhere. I thought Gwacham was this team's most consistent defensive lineman last season, showcasing some high-quality pass rush moves. However, what I'll look for Gwacham to improve this season will be his physicality, which I think he really struggled with at times last year. I think the run defense wasn't up to snub a lot of the time, so we'll see if he can improve that this year, but I think there's a lot of potential for him to be an impact pass rusher in the CFL. And then Tim Bonner, another second-year player who's a high-energy guy who really stood out in terms of his consistency on a play-to-play basis last year. He mostly plays at defensive tackle, but he could play a little bit on the edge on occasion. I wouldn't be surprised if he's this unit's breakout star this season, given that high motor. Maybe he can also provide that physicality that this team is lacking up front. And then David Menard, who's actually last year's East Division nominee for Most Outstanding Canadian when he was with Montreal, and he actually returns to BC where he spent a lot of his career prior to 2019. And what I think Menard really excels at is his versatility to play both defensive tackle and end. Being able to just switch between those positions and use them in multiple ways has been such a key part of his effectiveness during his career. He's another player who has a really high motor as well. However, I wouldn't expect similar production to what he had last year. I think he had like 9 or 10 sacks and like a rotational role with Montreal. He didn't even start a game. I think he started maybe one game all of last year, and he was just able to produce sacks at an absurdly high rate for a defensive lineman. So I wouldn't expect that kind of production next year for Menard, but I think he's a very solid player who you can start as a Canadian in this defense. And then Woody Barron, a veteran defensive tackle who brings plenty of starting experience from his time with Montreal. I wouldn't say there's anything he excels at from a skill set standpoint, but he's a solid player in most aspects. Overall, not the type of guy I think is going to be a breakout star, but a guy that is good to have in the rotation. And then Mathieu Betts, another Canadian here who's a former second overall pick in the CFL draft. He saw plenty of starting opportunities last year for Edmonton. However, his production was severely lacking with 0 sacks in 14 games, which included 8 starts at defensive end. So obviously that's a red flag. However, he was quickly signed in free agency this year by BC, and he may be destined for a big role again in this defense. Let's see if he makes good on his physical talent that he had going into the draft, and we'll see if he can actually produce this year. And, maybe he was doing a little bit more than what I gave him credit for in terms of when I was ranking stuff for this video, but I just didn't see him make an impact all that often last year with Edmonton. I know it was a terrible team, but I'm looking for more from Betts this year. And then unfortunately, Steven Richardson, who's a difference-making defensive tackle who was BC's prized free agent signing this offseason. Unfortunately, he suffered an injury while training before training camp and will likely miss the entire season this year. Just so unfortunate. He would have been by far the best player of this entire unit if he was healthy. And then Josh Banks, who's a second-year player who mostly contributed as a run-stopping defensive tackle in year 1. See if he continues that this year. And then Thibaut Debale, who is a global from Belgium who played in 3 games for Edmonton last season, but I don't think he recorded any stats in those games. So ultimately, I just have questions about this unit's physicality, and I think they could potentially have a pretty good pass rush rotation with this group, but that injury to Richardson is really going to hurt them ultimately, I think, this year. Now let's take a look at the enormous list of defensive line rookies that they're bringing to camp, and let's start with just basically their entire 2022 CFL draft class, drafting like 4 or 5 defensive linemen. 5 Canadian defensive linemen in this year's draft, and the highest of which was Nathan Cherry at 3rd overall in the 1st round out of Saskatchewan. He's a player that fits more of a defensive tackle build and was very productive in his U Sports career. We'll see if he can make an impact. He was drafted a little bit higher than a lot of people saw him going. Josh Archibald, a 3rd round pick out of McGill. I thought he was a player who should have gone much higher. I think ultimately he could have went in the 1st round. I think he had that talent. So getting him here in the 3rd round, I thought that was a great pick for BC. And then Riley Pickett, who was Cherry's teammate at the University of Saskatchewan, who was crucial to the Huskies' berth in the Vanier Cup in 2021. And then Frederick Evillard, a little bit interesting player here, who's a former wide receiver at the U Sports level, who made the switch to defensive line in his final year at Ottawa. He was selected in the 6th round. And then finally, the team's last pick in the CFL draft in the 8th round was Adam Wallace out of Ottawa. So interesting group of rookie Canadians on the defensive line, and undoubtedly you got to think at least 1 or 2 of these guys actually finds a way onto this team this year and can make an impact. And then Carlos Bronze, who very interesting guy, made viral scenes with pink hair prior to the CFL Global Combine this year. He was actually the 3rd overall pick in this year's global draft as well in the 1st round. He's a native of Latvia, and so we'll see if he can make an impact and stay on the roster here as one of their globals. And then Casey Williams, who's a former star at Stony Brook University. Miles Fox, a 25-year-old defensive tackle from Wake Forest. Cameron Murray, a 300-pound defensive tackle who played for Oklahoma State. Sion Tahima, who played college football at Southeastern Louisiana, the same school, ironically, as Stampeders defensive end Isaac Ademi Berglund, who's Canadian. And then Romeo McKnight, a 6'5", 260-pound player that fits the profile of a guy that can play a little bit of inside and out at the CFL level on the defensive line. So overall, I'm just really fascinated to see what happens with all of these rookies that they're bringing to camp here that they drafted this year in the CFL draft. Now, so far in this video, I've been pretty hard on the Lions in terms of their positional rankings, but I'm about to make it up to you, Lions fans. right here with the linebackers, which are going to come in at first in the CFL. And I got a comment on one of my last videos on the Saskatchewan Roughriders roster review asking, like, how are the Riders not the number one linebacking core in the CFL? And to be honest, I was going back and forth who to rank number one, BC or Saskatchewan. But ultimately, I give BC the slight edge here because of the two stud Canadians that they have in this unit that really help them ratio-wise. And we'll start with Bo Lacombe, who is the reigning most outstanding Canadian in the CFL, who was a stat sheet stuffer in 2021. Lacombe has a background at safety, which is evident when you see him at linebacker, where he has above average coverage range. He also brings the reputation of being one of the heaviest hitters in the CFL. And again, that was better utilized at linebacker last year, where everything really came together for him skill set wise and ultimately cultivated in a most outstanding Canadian campaign and ultimately a successful one at that. So really impressed with Bo Lacombe last year, one of the most improved players in the entire CFL. Really did not see that coming. And then Jordan Williams, who was the CFL Rookie of the Year last year after being the number one overall pick in the 2020 CFL draft. Williams is an elite athlete at the linebacker position, which allowed him to be a sideline-to-sideline tackling machine in year one. I think he's going to get even better as he continues to get more of a comfortable feel in zone coverage. But overall, just such a stud already in his CFL career. Just rare speed for the linebacking spot, especially from a national. And then Luchez Purifoy, one of their big free agent additions here, who comes over from Saskatchewan, who's a versatile defender who has played halfback, safety, in addition to being a great strong side linebacker in his career. Purifoy is the type of player that has both excellent coverage range as well as the physicality required to play closer to the line of scrimmage. Additionally, back in 2019, he was an excellent kick returner, which was kind of forgotten last year, and Saskatchewan didn't really use him a lot in that sense, but can potentially play that role here for BC. And I'm really excited to see what he can bring to this defense and different elements. He can play different spots for this unit. And then Micah Hallway, a very interesting addition that they just signed, I think it was last week. And he's a veteran American who brings physicality and starting experience to this linebacking room. I thought Alway looked awesome last year with Ottawa, but he ultimately took his time signing a contract this offseason after exploring opportunities in the NFL. The only thing with this signing here is I don't really know where he slots into BC's lineup here, given the presence of Lacombe at his usual weak side linebacker spot. I don't know if he's the type of guy that can play the middle linebacker position on a consistent basis. So, we'll see how he slots in, but an interesting name, and clearly you have so much talent here if he's your fourth linebacker. And then Isaiah Gazilek-Messam, a Canadian who has the versatility to play sub-linebacker but also some safety. He played much less of a role in 2021 after being a starter for long stretches of 2019, so we'll see if he can factor in a little bit more this season. And then Ben Hladek, an athletic special teamer who immediately contributed in that role last year. He was the former third-round pick of the Lions in 2021. And then Kevin Francis, who's a career special teams ace who I wouldn't expect to start many games for this team. And then finally, Josh Woods, a second-year player who got his feet wet playing in his first two CFL games at the end of last season, so the final couple games for the Lions last year. So, interesting group in the linebacking core. I think overall, great top-end talent, great depth, and ultimately, I think it's deserving of the first ranking in the CFL in terms of the linebacking groups. Now, looking at the linebacker rookies, and it's just one. It's actually just Ryder Varga, who is this team's third-round pick out of Regina this year. And, he was a very productive player at U Sports, so we'll see if he can make an impact or if he's even going to be staying in the CFL this season. I do believe he's one of those guys that potentially go back to school. Was a guy that was talked about as a guy that could have potentially went a lot earlier if teams knew that he was actually going to be going to the CFL this season. So ultimately, we'll see if he makes an impact this year, but that he's the only guy. And then looking at their defensive back room, which is going to come in at second in the CFL. And I just really like the back end of this defense, the coverage unit of this defense. So much experience, so much high-end talent. And we'll start with TJ Lee, who's really the epitome of all that. He's a veteran halfback who's long been one of the team's best players. He brings a great combination of coverage range and physicality from that boundary halfback spot that you don't often see. He's quite simply just always around the ball when you watch the Lions play. And overall, I think he's one of the best defensive backs in the entire CFL. He's one of my highest rated halfbacks going into this season. And then you have Gary Peters, who's Lee's longtime partner at the boundary side cornerback position. Peters has a reputation as one of the league's best ball hawks. being aggressive while in coverage. He had his down moments in 2021. Sometimes he gave up a lot of big plays, but I still think he's one of the better defensive backs in the league, and ultimately, you gotta trust that this combination that has been together for so long here in BC is gonna be able to lock down that boundary side of the defense this year for BC. And then Marcus Sayles, who's a player that is capable of playing halfback, safety, and a little bit of strong side linebacker. Sayles was a big offseason addition going into the 2021 season, and I felt he wasn't as impactful with BC as he was with Winnipeg in 2019 when he was one of the best playmakers in the entire CFL. Still, I think he's an above average playmaker, often getting hands in passing lanes and forcing fumbles. You see that when he's, going for the tackle, he's consistently looking to strip that ball out, which you'd like to see. Cause turnovers, can change games. And I think he's a very solid starter to have in this unit who could play even better this year. And then Delvin Breaux, who comes out of retirement after missing all of last season. He was previously one of the league's premier cornerbacks with the Hamilton Tiger Cats, spent some time in the NFL with the New Orleans Saints in between stints with the Tiger Cats. And I think that ultimately, Delvin Breaux, it's going to be really interesting to see how he factors in with this team and how he's going to be after having a year off. We've seen other guys in the CFL do similar things in the past, so we'll see if he can make that successful return to the field. And then Keontae Harden, who's a second-year player who broke into the starting lineup as a rookie and made an immediate impact last year. He had his growing pains of inconsistency, but ultimately showed elite potential at playing the ball in the air. I think there was that one interception he had against Calgary early in the season that was one of the best interceptions I saw of any player last year. And then Jalen Edwards-Cooper, another second-year player who had his moments playing the field side corner last season. More consistency, I think, is needed, but I think he showed enough to warrant another shot in the starting lineup in year 2. We'll see if he gets it with all of these names that they have here with CFL experience. And then Victor Gamboa, a veteran who has been around the BC organization since 2019. He was only able to dress for 2 games last year, so we'll see if he's in this team's plans going forward still. And then you have a few Canadians here, starting with Hakeem Johnson, who has gradually earned a bigger role on defense after playing exclusively on special teams his first few seasons since coming out of Western. We'll see if he can continue that progression. Not really a great Canadian defensive back in this room. Then Jamie Harry, who has played in 11 games over the past 2 seasons and saw some snaps in the secondary in 2021. Again, see if he can make more of an impact. And then O'Shane Samuels, a special teamer with 14 career special teams tackles in 21 career games. And then finally, Tennille Cooper, who was a guy they recently signed who played in the CFL in 2019 with Winnipeg. I think it was a handful of games. So we'll see if he factors into the team's plans here. Ultimately, this unit has so much experience. It has superstars. And if Delvin Breaux can be anywhere close to where he was when he was with Hamilton, look out. Now let's flip over to the defensive back rookies, starting with Adrian Green, who was a fast riser in the CFL draft process this year, who played his college football at St. Mary's. He was the Lions' 4th round pick in this year's draft. Jacob Verlot, who was a territorial exemption signing by the Lions out of the Canadian Junior Football League. Verlot played for the Langley Rams. And then Kyle Claret, who's another guy who played for the Langley Rams as well. So we'll see if either of those guys make an impact in this secondary room that doesn't really have an established Canadian, like I said. And then Josh Thornton, who has previous pro experience in the NFL and XFL before signing with BC this offseason. I believe it was with the DC Defenders. And then Quincy Mauger, who is a 6-foot corner who played his college football for the Georgia Bulldogs. And then the last guy here, Emmanuel Rugamba, who is originally from Rwanda. He was the first Rwandan to sign with an NFL team in league history. So pretty impressive guy there. Now going on to our final position in these positional rankings with special teams, and they're going to come in at 3rd in the CFL, and I just don't see too many holes with this unit. I think Sean White is consistent of a kicker in the CFL as you can get. Stefan Flintoff looked really good. I didn't do a ton of punting analysis for these videos this year, but Flintoff was one of those guys that actually did impress me last year. I was kind of surprised that they carried an American punter because you really don't see that too often in the CFL unless they're just really good, and Flintoff was last year. And then for kick returner, I didn't really know who to put. You could put Luchez Purifoy back here as well, but I'll put Lucky Whitehead in there, even though I know he's not going to be doing it every time. If you want to have a big return, you can plug him back there every once in a while. And then finally, long snapper Tanner Dahl, who's been a veteran in the CFL the last couple of years. So ultimately, I think it's a really good special teams unit with options to use in the kick returning game as well. Now, putting all of those rankings together, and this is what you get. The Lions will come in at 9th in the CFL on offense, and unfortunately, somebody had to be, and I just think the inexperience in this group, offensive line issues, as I talked about, inexperience at quarterback, that's ultimately what sinks them to the bottom of the CFL in my rankings. But the good news is I have them actually at 3rd in the CFL on defense. I think that secondary and that back 8 looks really good. The defensive line, major questions about that, but I think if you can play really, really solid coverage, you could potentially generate some pressure from blitzes and whatnot. You can get creative on the defensive side, and I'm really interested to see if they can do that this year. Now let's look at how I think this team is going to line up this year, starting with the offense. And the questions with this group really, I think, comes down to the offensive line. Do they start only 2 Canadian offensive linemen, which is incredibly rare in the CFL, but they have a very interesting situation. They have a Canadian quarterback. They have 2 really stud Canadian linebackers, which we'll talk about in a second. They have an interesting situation in terms of a ratio makeup here. So they could potentially have the flexibility to do that. But the guy I have underlined here in the offensive line room is Peter Godber, who I can easily see losing his job in training camp to a better guy that performs. Philip Norman is an interesting guy at left guard who I didn't underline here because I think he's going to start if they start 3 Canadian offensive linemen, 3 American offensive linemen. And he has the versatility to play center as well, so he could take Godber's spot at center. And then in the receiving core, I really only have the question about that one spot. I think those other 4 guys are going to be your 4 starters in that receiving core, but I don't know if Hatcher is going to be that guy necessarily because he was just a guy that came in briefly last season. And so those are my questions about this group in terms of their offensive makeup. And then moving on to their defense, and I have a lot more questions here. So I underlined David Menard, East Division Most Outstanding Canadian, because I think Matthew Betts, 3 Down Nation, reported that he was one of the highest paid defensive linemen in the CFL for this season. And you're not going to give a guy with that much contract if you're not going to play him. And I think that you could see a very heavy rotation there with Betts and Menard. And ultimately, I think that you could see, depending on the week, a different guy could start at that spot. Again, I think Menard has that inside versatility as well to play defensive tackle. I underlined Woody Barron because he was just placed on this team's suspended list right before this video. He was still on this team's suspended list. So who knows if he's going to show up this year to play at this defensive tackle position. But he would be your replacement there for Steven Richardson. Tim Bonner, I'm pretty confident he's going to start after an impressive showing last year. Guacham, I think, is going to start at the defensive line. So I think those are probably your starters there on the defensive line for the BC Lions. And then the linebacking core is very interesting because, and ultimately I didn't underline any of these guys because I think these guys are all very worthy of these spots. But Micah Alway, I'm really interested to see what they do. Do they use that new rule they just put in the CBA about rotating a veteran American with one of your Canadian starters? Always one of those players that actually fits that criteria, I believe. So that's my questions about the defense for the BC Lions. But ultimately, like I said, I actually really like this unit outside of that defensive line room if they can figure that out. Now let's go on to my team award predictions, starting with Most Outstanding Player, and I'm going with Lucky Whitehead here. I think you could go with other options as well. Potentially this is a spot where you could see a defensive player win this award for this team, but I'm going with Whitehead because he's the most explosive player on this team. Even though I do think Burnham is a slightly better receiver still in the CFL, I think that Whitehead is just such an explosive player, and he's going to create so many big plays for this team on a weekly basis. Maybe Nathan Rourke actually puts it all together and becomes this team's Most Outstanding Player nominee, but we'll have to wait and see on that. And then Most Outstanding Defensive Player, I'm going with Luchez Purifoy, who is this team's big offseason free agent signing on defense, or one of them. And I think that Purifoy is just a criminally underrated player who I thought was arguably Saskatchewan's best defensive player last year and didn't even receive a Division All-Star nod, if I'm remembering correctly. So I think he's going to be the guy that wins this award here among a really talented Lions defense. And then Most Outstanding Canadian, I'm going with Jordan Williams, middle linebacker, who's just going to rack up so many tackles, 100+ tackles, and his stats are going to be looking really good by the end of the season. So I think he's going to appeal himself to voters for that award. And then finally, most outstanding offensive lineman, I'm going with Joel Figueroa at left tackle, but I hope it's one of these other guys that emerges ultimately, but I just don't have too much faith in that right now. And that leads me into the key question for this team this year, and it's quite simply, does this offensive line give Nathan Rourke a chance to succeed? Because I think Nathan Rourke has all the tools. He just needs to be given a fair evaluation opportunity. And oftentimes you don't get that as a quarterback in the CFL. It's not a given thing. So I'm really interested to see if he can actually succeed given this offensive line this year. He can move around behind that offensive line, which I think is going to help him succeed. But ultimately, I don't know if he's going to be able to overcome this unit, which I think is probably the worst offensive line on paper going into this CFL season. So ultimately, I think that is the key question for the BC Lions going into this year, and it's going to be a key barometer of their success. But with that said, that is going to be the end of this roster review, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Be sure to let me know what your thoughts on the BC Lions going into this season are. Is this a team that's capable of making the playoffs in a very tough West Division? This is a crossover team. What do you think? Be sure to let me know in the comment section. And with that said, I hope everyone has a great day. Be sure to hit like and subscribe as always. It really helps me out, guys. I really appreciate it. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.